Inevitably, the moment politicians put their weight behind something and attach their name to it in some ways, of course, money will flow. That's the way it goes. And inevitably, research, development, institutions started to bubble up, if we can put it that way, which were going to be researching climate, but with a particular emphasis on the relationship between carbon dioxide and temperature.
It looks like tomorrow I'll be shoveling 10 feet of global warming.
Global warming can cause weather at both extremes, hot and cold.
I see, so you're saying warming makes it colder.
Could Homer Simpson be right for once? Does global warming really make it colder? Doesn't make any sense, does it? But we're supposed to believe it. After all, Lisa Simpson says global warming is real, and so do all the scientists, right?
I've often heard it said that there is a consensus of thousands of scientists on the global warming issue and that humans are causing a catastrophic change to the climate system. Well, I am one scientist, and there are many that simply think that is not true.
Millions of years ago, rivers flowed between the mountains of Antarctica, which are now buried under a mile of ice. In just the past 10,000 years, the Earth has been much warmer than it's been during all this global warming nonsense.
If we go back 8,000 years, in the Holocene period, our current interglacial, it was much warmer than it is today. Now, the polar bears obviously survived that period. They're with us today. They are very adaptable, and these warm periods in the past, what we call hypsithermals, pose no problem for them.
So why all the hype about global warming?
People have decided you have to convince other people that since no scientist disagrees, you shouldn't disagree either. But that, whenever you hear that in science, that's pure propaganda.
It's become a great industry in itself. And if the whole global warming farrago collapsed, there'd be an awful lot of people out of jobs and looking for work.
It's all about money, just like any other scam.
Prior to Bush the Elder, I think the level of funding for climate and climate-related sciences was somewhere around the order of $170 million a year, which was reasonable for the size of the field. It jumped to $2 billion a year, more than a factor of 10. And yeah, that changed a lot. I mean,
that's a lot of jobs.
A lot of jobs. It brought a lot of new people into it who otherwise were not interested. So you developed whole cadres of people whose only interest in the field was that there was global warming.
And it's a very big scam with a lot of key players.
CO2 is warming the planet. And the equation on CO2 is actually a very straightforward one. If you sum up the CO2 that gets emitted, that leads to a temperature increase. And that temperature increase leads to some very negative effects.
Negative effects like rising temperatures, cataclysmic storms, and rising sea levels. And to top it all off, humans are supposed to be to blame for it. All because of a naturally occurring and life-giving gas called carbon dioxide. But was carbon dioxide really what caused the unusually warm weather we saw in the past decade?
Anyone who goes around and says that carbon dioxide is responsible for most of the warming of the 20th century hasn't looked at the basic numbers.
So what are those basic numbers? Over 99% of the atmosphere is composed of two gases, nitrogen and oxygen. The remaining roughly 1% is composed primarily of 8 other gases: argon, water vapor, carbon dioxide, neon, helium, methane, krypton, and hydrogen. The water vapor, methane, and carbon dioxide are called greenhouse gases. That means they hold back some of the radiant heat from the sun from escaping into space. Without greenhouse gases, you would freeze to death shortly after the sun set. anywhere on the planet.
The atmosphere is made up of a multitude of gases. A small percentage of them we call greenhouse gases. And of that very small percentage of greenhouse gases, 95% of it is water vapor. It's the most important greenhouse gas.
Water vapor is a greenhouse gas, by far the most important greenhouse gas.
Water vapor is the most plentiful and important greenhouse gas, and water covers 75% of the Earth. So how much carbon dioxide are we dealing with here?
If you take CO2 as a percentage of all the gases in the atmosphere, the oxygen, the nitrogen, and argon, and so on, it's 0.054%. It's an incredibly small portion. And then, of course, you've got to take that portion that supposedly humans are adding, which is the focus of all the concern, and it gets even smaller.
Water vapor, the most significant and plentiful greenhouse gas, is being ignored, and the attention is going to carbon dioxide. Al Gore's documentary told us that CO2 was what was driving the climate.
We're going back in time now, 650,000 years. Here's what the temperature has been on our Earth. Now, one thing that kind of jumps out at you is, did they ever fit together? Most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. The relationship is actually very complicated, but there is one relationship that is far more powerful than all the others, and it is this. When there is more carbon dioxide, the temperature gets warmer.
Are carbon dioxide and temperature connected?
Yes, they are, but not in the way that Al Gore and the IPCC have claimed. Carbon dioxide is a product of life. Plants breathe it in, animals exhale it. Warm weather stimulates more life, and therefore more carbon dioxide. Totally the opposite of what the global warming crowd is saying.
Al Gore says the relationship between temperature and CO2 is complicated, but he doesn't say what those complications are. In fact, there was something very important in the ice core data that he failed to mention. Professor Ian Clark is a leading Arctic paleoclimatologist who looks back into the Earth's temperature record tens of millions of years. Professor Clark and others have indeed discovered, as Al Gore says, a link between carbon dioxide and temperature. But what Al Gore doesn't say is that the link is the wrong way round.
And we see the temperature going up, and then we see the CO2 coming up. CO2 lags behind that increase. It's got an 800-year lag, so temperature is leading CO2 by 800 years.
There have now been several major ice core surveys. Every one of them shows the same thing. The temperature rises or falls, and then, after a few hundred years, carbon dioxide follows.
Why does CO2 increase from warm weather?
Well, because warm weather stimulates life. Trees don't grow in the wintertime. If you look at the polar regions, you have polar bears, seals, penguins at the South Pole. That's about it. As you move closer to the equator and the tropics, the biodiversity increases. And the richest biospheres on Earth are the tropical rainforests and the coral reefs, both of which are only found in the warmest parts of the Earth. The warmer the climate, the more life, and therefore the more carbon dioxide. And the ice core records show this very clearly.
The ice core record goes to the very heart of the problem we have here. They said, if the CO2 increases in the atmosphere as a greenhouse gas, then the temperature will go up. But the ice core record shows exactly the opposite. So the fundamental assumption, the most fundamental assumption of the whole theory of climate change due to humans is shown to be wrong.
Not only do the ice core data tell us that climate drives CO2 levels and not the other way around, so does recent history. The 35-year post-war economic boom from 1940 to 1975 marked the largest man-made CO2 emissions the world had seen, yet the temperature dropped.
CO2 began to increase exponentially in about 1940, but the temperature actually began to decrease 1940, continued till about 1975. So this is the opposite relation. When the CO2 is increasing rapidly, but yet the temperature is decreasing, then we cannot say that CO2 and the temperature go together.
Temperature went up significantly up to 1940 when human production of CO2 was relatively low. And then in the post-war years, when industry and the whole economies of the world really got going, and human production of CO2 just soared, the global temperature was going down. In other words, the facts didn't fit the theory.
Most of the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere doesn't come from humans. In fact, the April eruption of Iceland's Eyjafjallajökull volcano released more CO2 in the first 5 days of its eruption than humans have since the end of World War II. Based on that, if the people behind global warming were correct, we should be experiencing unseasonably warm weather, when in fact temperatures have been below normal. The theory just doesn't line up with the facts.
My car is not running very well, so I'm going to ignore the engine, which is the sun, and I'm going to ignore the transmission, which is the water vapor, and I'm going to look at one nut on the right rear wheel, which is the human-produced CO2. It's that, the science is that bad.
So who came up with all this bad science? And how did they come up with it? The IPCC, or Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, is a branch of the United Nations that began in 1990, growing out from a climate study group set up in the late 1980s in the United Kingdom.
At the request of Mrs. Thatcher, the UK Met Office set up a climate modelling unit which provided the basis for a new international committee called the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC.
They came out with the first big report which predicted climatic disaster as a result of global warming. I remember going to the scientific press conference and being amazed by two things. First, the simplicity and eloquence of the message and the vigour with which it was delivered. And secondly, the total disregard of all climate science up till that time, including, incidentally, the role of the sun, which had been the subject of a major meeting at the Royal Society just a few months earlier.
The IPCC completely left the sun out of its global warming and climate change models.
Isn't it bizarre to think that it's humans, when we're filling up our car, turning on our lights, that we're the ones controlling climate? Just look in the sky. Look at that massive thing, the sun. Even humans at our present 6.5 billion are minute relative to that.
The United Nations later explained the sun was not considered because it was out of human control. The United Nations and the IPCC further stated that the sun had no effect on climate. Are we to believe that carbon dioxide, a natural gas that makes up less than 0.1% of the atmosphere, is more responsible for warming than the sun? Science has known for centuries that the sun goes through cycles of warming up and cooling down. Sunspot activity has been recorded for hundreds of years, and so have their effect on our climate.
What are sunspots?
Sunspots are areas of intense magnetic activity on the surface of the sun. Sunspots were originally discovered by Chinese astronomers in about 28 BC. They were not accurately understood until Galileo observed them through a telescope in about 1610.
How are sunspots connected to our climate?
We have about 400 years of scientific records that show sunspots have a direct relation to temperatures on Earth. The sunspots release vast amounts of cosmic rays, which are what create clouds, water vapor, and that, of course, has a warming effect on the Earth. Because we have precise measurements of solar activity over the past century, we can compare that activity to the climate. The results speak for themselves. When the sun heats up, the temperature on Earth rises. When the sun cools down, so do we. Is that so hard to understand?